I'm Doug Jolley. Welcome to my basement retreat. We'll go in and see the railroad here in just a minute. It's an Sn3 railroad, model in the 3rd Division of the Denver Rio Grande Western Narrow Gauge. Ran from Gunnison, Colorado to Ridgeway, Colorado. So with no more introduction than that, let's go see the railroad. The era that we're modeling is 1955-ish. And I know right now for some of the die-hard Rio Grande narrow gauge fans, you're going to say you're modeling a railroad that was out of existence by 1949 or 1951. Well, that's true, I am. But the reason that they went out of business in 1949 is because of this landslip right here. And this landslip had been a constant problem for the railroad for years. And it had come down a couple of times before, and finally in 1949 it slipped one more time. And in 1949 the Rio Grande said, we're not rebuilding it again. So that was the end of the line from Gunnison to Montrose. There was a little bit of narrow gauge left in Montrose at the time. The RGS was still running until 1951, and in 1951, when the RGS went out of business, the narrow gauge was done on this end of the railroad. Now, in my world, in 1949, when this slip come down, the Rio Grande decided to rebuild it one more time. And the reason for that decision was because there was a couple of connections here. There was a connection at Cow Creek with a railroad called the San Miguel and Southern, and they were still shipping some business. And there was also a connection with the Timber Creek Railway up near Crested Butte. The Timber Creek Railway was a lumber railroad in the early days that provided ties and timbers for the construction of the Rio Grande when they were building through the area. At the time when the Rio Grande construction basically stopped, the Timber Creek Railway started to fade as well. A lot of their equipment was sold off. The right-of-way was still in place when silver was discovered up at an area just above there called Pollardy. So the railroad was gotten another breath of life from the ore industry. So the Timber Creek Railway was left scrambling to find equipment to haul ore now rather than logs. So with those connections, with the ore coming out of Poverty and the little bit of traffic coming off of the San Miguel and Southern, the Rio Grande decided to rebuild this slip just one more time. So here we are, 4 years after they've rebuilt the slip, and we're still railroading out here. The real historians will note that there was no Timber Creek Railway and there was no San Miguel and Southern. But the real historians will also understand that in the later years of the 3rd Division, there was no traffic either. So in order to make the model railroad more interesting, I added a couple of freelance railroads, one being the Timber Creek, which is a railroad that I've modeled for years, my own freelance railroad, and the San Miguel and Southern, a friend of mine, Bill Adkins, he had a connection at Cow Creek on his railroad. So I incorporated both of those railroads, and we've got 2 extra connections to convince the Rio Grande to rebuild this slip, and here we go, we're still railroading. With that explanation, the railroad is built in an 18 by 43 foot room. And as you can see, it's double deck. The reason for the double deck, I'm like most people, I like big expanses. But the one thing that I did like is I like these long open runs like we've got right here. And in order to accomplish that and still get some operating in on the thing, I felt double deck was a necessity. And with the 9-foot ceilings, it seemed like a natural thing to do. So that was the reason for the double deck. Predominantly, the lower deck is the Rio Grande 3rd Division, and it does extend a little bit up here on the top. But for the most part, the upper deck is the freelance railroads. some people like to know the minimum radius on this is 28. I will say the Y at Cyril, the prototype was real sharp radius, and it is here too. The radius on the Cyril Y here is 26 to 27 inches, something like that, which in Sn3 is kind of pushing it a little bit for some of the larger locomotives. Fortunately for me, the 3rd Division never really operated very many large locomotives, the largest locomotive being a K27. Now you will notice as we go around the railroad, you'll see some K36s and some K28s perhaps. The reason for that is my real interest in modeling the Rio Grande narrow gauge came from the fact that in 1978, I went to work for the Rio Grande narrow gauge in Durango, Colorado. And so my favorite locomotives became the K28s. Those were the locomotives I got to operate and actually work on. So even though they look horrendously out of place in the 3rd Division to me, they're my favorite locomotive and it's my railroad, so I'm running them. For the exception of the helix and the staging yard, the track is all hand laid, including cutting the ties myself. I've got my own sawmill in the shop in there, and I cut my own ties and timbers. And there's 23 dual gauge switches in this area here where the standard gauge comes into Montrose, all hand built on PC ties. And there's 101 narrow gauge switches. So needless to say, the railroad has been an endeavor and taken me some time to finish, but we're working toward that. The construction, bits and pieces of it came from old railroads I had in a different place. Would I do that again? Probably not, because your talents and techniques get better as years go on. And some of the things that's been a result of that is the track has got some sags and bows in it, like the prototype, I guess. But it would be nice not to have those when it comes time to operating. The construction started out with chicken wire. I moved from chicken wire to foam. I didn't like the foam because I found that the foam was noisy. So I got away from the foam and I moved more toward a cardboard web and plaster type. And that seemed to work out well. So you'll see all 3 types of construction on this. Rocks are all plaster castings. The foliage is whatever I can find, any weed, anything that looks like it might be a prototype. Most of the deciduous trees are sagebrush armatures with super tree material on them. Some of the trees are just made from super tree material. The poplars back here, you'll see behind Montrose, that's actually a type of sage that's growing in my backyard. And in the fall, I just clip them off and put some green foliage on them, and they become poplars. I love to build rolling stock, so consequently, I've ended up with way more rolling stock than I really need, even on a layout this size. I have a lot of equipment that travels across the layout and into staging yards on either end of it. So some cars you may not see again for a while, which I kind of like. One of the things that I've just recently done on the Rio Grande southern end of the railroad, on the south end, is I've actually built a drawer. My south end staging drawer is what I call it. But that's where the cars, once they get to Ridgeway and go out onto the RGS or farther out onto the San Miguel and Southern, they go into this drawer. And then they're just off the railroad for a while. One of the things that I really like to do is I like to look at eBay or train shows and find kits and things that people have started and maybe didn't turn out the way that they should have turned out. So I like to buy these, I call them wrecks. I buy these old wrecks and I bring them home and I rebuild them. And it's just one of the satisfactions I get of taking something that was broken and make it work again. Some of the highlights here in Montrose, you might recognize the Texaco dealer here. That was always a prominent thing along the narrow gauge there and is still today. The freight depot was there for many years. They finally tore it down maybe 10 or 15 years ago. This was the freight depot that was in Montrose. There was an oil distributorship across the tracks. This little building, as near as I can tell, it's been abandoned in every picture that I've seen, but I think that it was an old produce building. at one time. Part of the reason that I got so interested in Montrose was it was really my first encounter with dual gauge track. In the early 70s, when I visited Montrose, a lot of this narrow gauge and the crossings and stuff was still in the third rail was still in the crossings. You could see where the narrow gauge had been, and there was quite a few reminders of the narrow gauge at the time. So I kind of spent a lot of time going around the town, looking at buildings and looking at the remnants of the narrow gauge. And probably the most famous building that people think of in Montrose was the Montrose Potato Growers Association. And I would have loved to have room to build that building, but unfortunately, my just wasn't wide enough right here to build that one. So what I did instead, my wife and I actually built this Maury Produce building. It was an old structure, and it again was a produce warehouse. Montrose was big for produce because of up around in the Uncompahgre Valley, up in Delta and Olathe and up that way. They grew a lot of cherries and peaches and apples. So even though it had been torn down, as near as I can tell, in the late 40s sometime, I wanted some type of a produce building there other than just a picture on the backdrop. So we built this structure that really wasn't there in the years that I modeled. This Gunnison plow, that was a real popular piece of equipment for the rail fans to photograph for some reason. They loved that plow, so I naturally had to build that. This flour mill building in the back, that building is actually still in Montrose. The Montrose elevator was there till about 5 or 6 years ago. Then they tore this structure down. One of the interesting stories about Montrose, when this line was severed in 1949, in their world, not mine, the shippers out just east of Montrose had a contract with the railroad to haul their produce into town. And even though it was only 6 or 7 miles into town, they had a contract, and by gosh, they held the railroad to it. So what the railroad did is they maintained this 6 or 7 miles outside of Montrose and brought 2 40-foot narrow gauge reefers over here to service this contract. They would load these cars, haul them 5 or 6 miles into town to the dock, and then transload them from these to standard gauge cars in Montrose. And they'd done that for 3 or 4 years before the contract expired. Here we are now at Cyril Summit. And as I mentioned before, this is the Y that was probably the sharpest radius on the railroad, and it is on my layout as well. Basically, all this Y was used for was to turn helpers coming from both Montrose and from Cimarron. They had to push trains up both sides of this hill. So that was basically all this Y was used for. At one time, there was a depot that sat here in the middle of the Y. It was torn down in the very early years, but in my world, it was not torn down at all. It was simply moved from there to Cow Creek when they needed a depot to interchange with the San Miguel and Southern and Cow Creek. So as we get farther down the line, we'll probably run into that depot. I'd seen Cyril in the pictures a lot, and I always wondered what it really looked like. So I went searching for it here about 20 years ago. And I just happened to stop on the highway at the summit of Cyril and went through an open gate up there and walked up the hill. And when I walked up the hill, I actually came up right on the tail of the Y. And when I came up the hill, you could see the Y laid out right in front of you. As I walked down this track, when I got closer down here to where that little shanty is, there's still a wooden crosswalk that crossed the tracks there. And the walk is still there. The tracks have been gone for 50 years, but the wooden walk is still there across there. So if you're ever in the neighborhood, it's worth walking up there and looking at if you get a chance to do it. This eastbound empty that we've been following is stopped for orders here at the station at Cimarron. They'll stop here and get orders and check to make sure that there's nothing coming their direction. They hauled a lot of stock out of Cimarron. Its primary purpose in the early days, and even toward the end, was for a helper station. And they've put helpers on here mostly for Cyril, but once in a while they'd have to push up toward Gunnison as well. So consequently, there's another Y here on the railroad to turn helpers. It's one of the few double-spouted water tanks on the system. See where they pump water out of the river for it. Just kind of a neat little place that a lot of the rail fans photographed in the last days of the Rio Grande. As this coal empty leaves Cimarron, you can see it's headed up into a helix. On the railroad, the helix is actually the beginning of the Black Canyon here. And it'll traverse these 7 loops of the Black Canyon helix and actually come out at the Curricani siding when it gets to the top level. I would have liked to avoid building a helix. I'd heard all of the horror stories about them, but I wanted to keep as long of distances between places as I could, and the helix really helped solve that. So as this thing has gone into the Black Canyon and out of sight, I think it's probably time to leave the main line, and let's go see if we can catch something down on the Ridgeway branch. And here we are at the end of the Ridgeway branch line at Ridgeway. At one time, the track used to go farther on up into Uray, but that was abandoned a couple of years ago. And in the real world, again, the RGS was abandoned in 1951, but because of the traffic on the 3rd Division of the Rio Grande and them consequently rebuilding the land slip, the RGS was able to maintain business for a few more years too. So here we are in 1955 again, and the RGS as well as the Rio Grande, of course, are struggling. One of the things that the RGS does have here is they have actually entered into a contract with the San Miguel and Southern. And since the San Miguel and Southern actually runs from Cow Creek on the 3rd Division's branch to Ridgeway out to Natarita coming off of the RGS at Placerville, the RGS has agreed to handle all of the San Miguel and Southern's traffic from Cow Creek to Placerville. So They have the contract here, and we're just about to catch a train leaving here with the San Miguel and Southern business for Cow Creek. As I mentioned before, the depot at Cyril Summit disappeared fairly early, and historians would have you believe that the building was demolished and dismantled in the site, but in our world, we know different. We know that it was actually removed from Cyril Summit and moved to Cow Creek because they needed a depot there to act as an interchange point with the San Miguel and Southern Railway. Okay, we've left the Ridgeway branch now and skedaddled on up the line back up toward Crested Butte to where the other freelance portion of the railroad is. And this is the upper reach of the Timber Creek Railway. And this is where the mining area is at Poverty. This is the reason that the Timber Creek Railway switched from hauling lumber to hauling ore. You can see here some of the older mining structures that were up here. We've got a mill over here that's still operating. We've got a mill here that's not operating. We've got a big supply house here. We've got the depot still that's still in operation. And for the miners up here, we've actually even got a boarding house built here with a cafe in it. As you can see, there's another old abandoned head frame and mine up here. This is the turntable that still gets used occasionally. The gantry crane here is used mostly anymore just to repair ore cars that aren't quite fit to make the trip back. But once in a while it is used for material that's shipped up here, bulk materials. This tipple is where all of the ore comes from. From here, it's traversed all the way back down the valley to Gothic. And then at Gothic, the loads are exchanged for empties there with one crew. And the empties run back up here and the loads run up to Smelter Hill where they are dumped and made empty again. I see the ore train is loaded and just about to leave town, so let's see if we can't follow it for a bit. I'd like to take just a moment to acknowledge some of the help that I've had from some friends. None of this would be possible without tremendous help of friends, and I'm not going to try and name everybody because everybody's contributed a little bit of something. But two names that I will call out right away would be the late Brian Ellerby. It was through his designs and through his work with evergreen styrene that you might notice the ore cars say Yukon Copper on them. That was his railroad, and these were cars. A few of them were built by him. The rest of them were scratch built by me to his designs. I've always loved those cars, and it's a privilege to be able to operate those. And the other tremendous help, you've probably noticed all of the wonderful backdrops here. I'd like to take credit for at least some of them, but there's very few of it that I've painted myself. Most of it was done by my good friend Rob Spangler. I don't know how I got so blessed to know a guy like him. He's just helped me in the 40-some years that I've known him. He's helped me tremendously by painting my backdrops through all these years. The railroad wouldn't be half of what it is without his work. Here we are at the Schoolhouse Crossing. We heard a rumor that there was a double-headed stock train of empties headed for the high country. So we're hoping that it'll show up here at the Schoolhouse Crossing. While we're waiting for it to show up, I might tell you a little bit about the structure here. This structure was actually built by my wife and I several years ago and shelved because we couldn't really find a place on the layout that we wanted to put it. But I think we finally settled on this place, and I got it in place just a few days ago. So this will be the first chance to shoot a train going past this if this doubleheader in fact shows up. As our stock train goes through Curricani, I might point out a couple of things about this spot. It was fairly deep in the Black Canyon on the North Fork of the Gunnison. Not only was it popular with the rail fans, it was popular with the fishermen, probably more so. You might notice there's one fisherman here as we speak that's coming up from the river right past that no trespassing sign that the Rio Grande seemed to put along their whole right-of-way, but I don't think many people paid much attention to him. Down here on this end of the Curricani siding is not quite finished yet. When I originally built this, the siding wasn't quite long enough for the way I wanted to operate, so I extended the siding about 2 feet. And in doing so, I had to redo some of the scenery right here. My original method was the chicken wire, and that worked for a while, but I found that the shapes were really too unpredictable. From there, I switched to foam. Foam was too noisy. More common now as I'm building the cardboard webbing. And most people, when they use cardboard webbing, they actually interlace the webbing and make laces out of it. That never worked well for me because I found that I had to put too much plaster over top of that to get rid of that lacing pattern. So I found it easier for me just to hot glue these pieces together, and I can shape them the way I want to shape them, and I don't have quite so many ridges to try and cover up with the plaster. As you can see, there's a lot of switches on this layout. Some of them are different than maybe some of them you've seen. Some of them are straight dual gauge switches. Some of them are switches that separate dual gauge from standard gauge. You needed them all when you were dealing with dual gauge. But one of the things that most people didn't see and weren't concerned about maybe was what they call a draw. And what a draw does is anytime that a train changes directions, you run into a problem with, as you can see here, the gauge of 3 feet is on this side of the rail here. But when it gets to that rail on the other side, it has to be on the opposite side. So what you need in the middle of this track, in the Y here, is what we call a draw. And what you can see here is there's a point right here and a guardrail. And what this guardrail will do is pull this wheel over so that it takes this point. And this basically moves the 3-foot gauge to the other side of the rail, so that it's, when it comes out to the other side, it's on the opposite side. And as simple as that seems, a lot of people don't realize that that has to happen. Anytime you go around a balloon loop or a Y, that has to happen if you're working with dual gauge track. And I say a lot of people don't realize, and that includes prototype railroaders. I can't tell you how many photographs I've seen taken in Alamosa, Salida, anywhere where there was a lot of dual gauge trackage, of some crew that thought that they would try and turn a train with mixed cars, with standard gauge cars and narrow gauge cars in the same consist. And it will not work going through a Y. You can take one or the other through the Y, but you can't take both of them. Well, here we are back again where we started. I want to thank you all for coming and viewing the railroad, and hopefully you've learned something, maybe picked up a tip of things that you can do, or I'm sure you've probably seen something you're going to say, I wish, but no, I'm not going to do that. At any rate, thanks for coming by, and one more time, I'd just like to say thank you to all of my friends and acquaintances and everybody that takes an interest in this place. They all contribute in one way or another. And I appreciate having you here. And by golly, if you're ever in town, stop by.